NASCAR tested the next-gen car at the Starr Roval on Monday and Tuesday, and NASCAR has talked more about an all-electric series that could be coming in the foreseeable future. What's going on, guys? It's Daniel, and welcome back to our video. We've got a ton of NASCAR stories discussed here today on the channel. Let's go and just jump straight into those really quickly. We're going to start off with a paint scheme news story, as we're going to talk about Bubba Wallace's 2021 Columbia Gold Rush scheme that we're going to see this weekend here at Texas Motor Speedway. I think there have been a lot of really good 2311 schemes. I also think there's been some bad 2311 schemes this year. But I think that this one is actually really good. I like the color schemes. They did a really good job on it. I think it's really solid. And I'm definitely looking forward to see it out on the racetrack. I think they did, like I said, I think they did a very awesome job and a very solid job on it. And I'm looking forward to see it out on the racetrack this weekend here at Texas Motor Speedway. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Ryan Vargas. As Ryan Vargas has announced that Swan Security will sponsor him for the final 4 races for the 2021 season. I believe that Best Buy will be association for one of those races. I believe at Martinsville later this year, but he will be sponsored by Swan Security for the final 4 races of the season. Swan Security has been stepping up to the plate and sponsoring drivers over the last year or so. They've been sponsoring Jordan Anderson this year as well. They sponsored when they had Austin Dillon on the car, driving the car for them, and they also now are sponsoring Ryan Vargas. They've sponsored Ryan Vargas in the past as well. I'm really happy to see that Ryan Vargas continues to pick up sponsorship, even if it's very little. The fact that he's got 4 races with Swan Security, I think is very excellent. I think it's really awesome. I'm happy to see that Ryan Vargas continues to pick up sponsorship for the foreseeable future. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Timmy Hill. As Timmy Hill is going to be driving to 13 for MBM Motorsports this weekend here at Texas Motor Speedway. It's really good to see that Timmy Hill is going to be riding in the second MBM Motorsports car. They are going to have 2 cars this weekend at Texas Motor Speedway, as the payouts usually for Texas Motor Speedway tend to be very high, so that's probably why they're going to be running 2 cars this weekend. I think Timmy Hill has a pretty decent shot of contending for maybe a top 30 or top 35. I think Timmy Hill is a very solid driver. Yes, I don't think the equipment overall, to be honest with you, is really that great, but I do think he has a pretty good shot of running at least for sure decent, and I'm really happy that he'll be once again in that 13 car. Hopefully he'll do very well this weekend. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about David Starr. As David Starr is going to be driving a 66 for MBM Motorsports this weekend at Texas Motor Speedway. I don't think David Starr is going to do better than Timmy Hill this weekend. I think David Starr is probably going to finish in the back. David Starr seems that it doesn't matter what team he's in. It seems like he's one of the slower drivers in the Cup Series. Seems like he's a guy that seems to get in the way. It's cool, though, that he is running in his hometown, basically his hometown race, considering he is from the Texas area. I'm really happy about that. But at the same time, I don't think David Starr is going to run really well in that 66 car. He's probably going to run near the back of the field. I don't think he has a good run this weekend in the 66. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about CJ McLaughlin. As CJ McLaughlin is going to be driving a 74 for My Carmen Racing this weekend at Texas Motor Speedway. I'm not very sure how to feel about CJ McLaughlin racing, because I think CJ McLaughlin has caused a few problems on the racetrack. I do think that My Carmen Racing has taken a little bit of a step backwards really over as the season progressed. I think they had a pretty good year last year as an organization. I do think losing Bailey Curry is probably one of the reasons why they have kind of struggled this year. No offense to Kyle Weathering, but I think Kyle Weathering's a good driver. I just think that the equipment's kind of faltered over the last year or so. It's probably a parts freeze or whatever that's been happening in the Xfinity Series. I'm not sure how he'll do. I don't think he cracks the top 30. I wouldn't be surprised if he falls out of the race for mechanical problems. We'll have to wait and see what happens, but he'll be driving 74 this weekend for My Carmen Racing. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Kaz Grawl. As Kaz Grawl is expected to drive the 31 for Jordan Anderson Racing this weekend at Texas Motor Speedway. It was originally listed in the entry list that Jordan Anderson was going to be driving the 31 car and running for the second time in a row in Texas in that car. We're now going to see Kaz Grawl in this car again. It's not confirmed from the team at this moment, but it's been reported that he will drive the 31. I'm really happy that Kaz is getting another opportunity in the 31 car. I think Kaz Grawl is a very solid and a very excellent driver. I think he knows how to get it done on the racetrack. And to me, I think that he'll be very successful in this car. I'm really happy to see him in the car once again. I think he's going to be great for the organization going into this weekend. I would not be surprised if this car contends for a top 10 or a top 15. Again, he's been pretty decent so far from the next-gen tests, ran really well in those tests that just happened, and we'll talk about that later in this episode. But I'm really happy to see that Kaz Grawl is getting another opportunity to race in Xfinity. I hope he gets more opportunities going forward. Maybe they should consider him running the final few races, though. We do know that Sage Current is going to be running the season finale at Phoenix in a couple weeks. Really happy to see that Kaz Grawl is going to be attempting to drive the 31 at Texas Motor Speedway. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about Roger Cruz. Now, Steve Phelps was at the Sports Business Media Watch Business Association thing that was going on. He was talking about quite a few posts that we'll talk about. But the first one I want to talk about is Roger Cruz. It was reported first by Adam Stern, and Steve Phelps had a quote saying that Roger Cruz is going to be a star in NASCAR. You could take that one to the bank. I think Roger Cruz is a very talented driver. I think he's a very, very good driver who's kind of proved it so far in ARCA. He's not won a race so far in ARCA, but I look up his late model stats, and the guy knows how to get it done. He's won quite a few late model races coming up through the ranks. Not only that, like I said, I think he's a very, very solid driver as a whole, and I do think that he is going to be someone for the future for the sport. And not only him, but Bubba Wallace is going to be someone I think for long term, for years to come, is going to be someone that's going to have a great impact for their organization. And I don't know what team he eventually will go to. We do know going into next year that he'll be driving part-time for Tommy Joe Martins and Cesar Baccarella's organization called Alpha Prime Racing in 2022 on a part-time basis on the short tracks. But eventually going into 2023, they expect him to run full-time with the organization. He's also going to be returning to Rev Racing in 2022 to run the full ARCA season with Nick Sanchez as a teammate. To me, I'm really excited about the future of Roger Cruz. I think Roger Cruz is a very, very talented driver, and I think a very talented up-and-comer who I think is going to have a great impact on the sport going forward. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Seth Chavka. As Seth Chavka is going to be the crew chief for Kyle Busch this weekend at Texas Motor Speedway. Now, I looked up Seth Chavka's stats, and Seth Chavka has been the race engineer, I believe, either for the 18 or the 20 car. He had been the race engineer for the 20 cars since 2018, I think up until this year when things basically changed. And now he'll be the crew chief for Kyle Busch this weekend. The reason that Seth Chavka is going to be in the car this weekend as a crew chief is because because Ben Bayshore got suspended for this upcoming race at Texas for 2 loose lug nuts and a $20,000 fine. He will not be crew chiefing this weekend. I'm very intrigued to see how Seth Chavka is going to do. I think this will be the first time that Seth Chavka is going to be crew chiefing and being up on the pit stocks. So I'm definitely very interested to see what happens there going forward. I'm definitely will say this. I'm very happy to see that he's getting an opportunity to crew chief. I just don't know how he's going to do, but to me, I'm really happy about it and I'm looking forward to see how he'll do. I think he won't do as good as Kyle Busch has done with Ben Bayshore this year, but I do think that we'll be very able to see a glimpse in the future of what things look like going forward for Seth Chavka, and maybe in the future he could become the crew chief for Kyle Busch in the Cup Series. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Jeb Burton. As Jeb Burton is not going to be returning to the 10 for Kaulig Racing in the Xfinity Series in 2022. He confirmed this in front stretch on Monday evening during the next gen test that he would not be returning to Kaulig Racing in 2022. Now, he did mention that he might make some Cup Series starts, though, for Kaulig Racing in 2022. Let's talk about Jeb Burton's season as a whole. Jeb Burton has kind of been a little bit underwhelming. I don't think he's been absolutely awful so far this year, but I do think that so far Jeb Burton has been a little bit underwhelming. Yes, he does have that win, like I said, at Talladega Super Speedway, but other than that, Jeb Burton has been very, very quiet. And I think so far not only has Justin Haley outshined him this year in that car, but I also do think that this year AJ Allmendinger has been able to outshine him in the equipment as well. Now, one of the big reasons also is because of funding. And remember, Nutrien AG is going to be dropping their sponsorship with the Kaulig Racing organization at the conclusion of the season. I really don't know what happens in Jeb Burton's career. I do think he has a shot of going on a part-time basis at Kaulig Racing's Xfinity Series program. Maybe drive us there in their second car. We know that AJ Allmendinger will be driving at least probably 7 or 8 races, or probably up to 10 races next year, and driving many, many races going into next year. So to me, I'm very intrigued to see what happens to Jeb Burton's career. I think Jeb Burton's future is really uncertain at the moment. He's still working on sponsorship as we speak. He's had some calls from some Cup teams. He's had some calls from Xfinity. I think if there is a potential that he can, if he wants to work in Xfinity and work with a team basically there, I think you have a few organizations that could be open up for him. You do have Our Motorsports. Now, they don't bring a ton of funding, but Our Motorsports could be open up for him. And my question is, what happens to the 10 car for Kaulig Racing? I think that this most likely could end up being where either Zane Smith goes or where Maya Snyder goes. Remember, it's been basically revealed at this point that Maya Snyder is most likely not going to be returning to Richard Childress Racing, at least in the main organization next year, and he's most likely going to be going to one of the RSR affiliates. I think this 100% is going to open up the playbook for Maya Snyder to go into the Kaulig Racing organization next year. Again, we're going to have to wait and see what happens. Like I said, I think Jeb Burton's first year full-time in a long time in NASCAR has kind of been underwhelming. I thought he used to be really, really talented back in the day, and I think he does have some talent. But at the same time, I want to see how he can do with another organization, and maybe he'll be able to do well. Considering I think was going to again. Anyways, I think he was going to get outperformed regardless. With Daniel Hemrick being there, has been extremely consistent. Who probably could win a race, and also AJ Allmendinger, who's going for a championship this year, and who could probably win the championship next year. We'll have to wait and see what happens, but he will not be returning to Kaulig Racing in 2022. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Bubba Wallace. Now, Bubba Wallace, there was, I think, during the sports media business competition thing or whatever it was, that big thing, that convention that happened today, Steve Phelps basically talked, Brandon Marshall asked a question about that, and Steve Phelps said that Bubba Wallace is a man who showed a lot of courage and a lot of grace last year. He never went down to the gutter. He certainly could have. Now, I think a lot of you know what happened last year. Last year, there was potentially a hate crime that basically happened, but however, it was basically revealed at that time that the hate crime had not happened, and there was no hate crime there. It basically was a pole rope that looked like a noose. Everyone thought it was a hate crime because last year at the time, you had the social justice movement that was going on at that particular point. So that was what was going on at that time. Denny Hamlin told Bubba Wallace during the offseason, though, that Bubba Wallace should probably take a break from being on social media because there's been a lot of toxicity, because Bubba Wallace is African-American, and you do have some racial tension that is still going on even in 2021, when there should not be racial tension going on in this country. You still do have racial tension going on in this country. Now, I've seen a lot of people that were really happy. You also had some people that were not happy that Bubba Wallace won. But I think Bubba Wallace, a couple weeks ago at Talladega, really showed that, hey, we can go out there and do this. Even though it was a rain-shortened victory, Bubba Wallace basically proved to everybody that he can go out there and prove that he can get it done on the racetrack. And again, Bubba Wallace has had, again, at points disappointing, but I do think ever since Booty Barker came in and worked with him as a crew chief, I think he's gotten to be a much better driver. So I think the impact Bubba's going to have, not just for drivers coming up that are African-American, but for other people in other communities and other sports, I think it's really awesome, and Bubba's impact has been really awesome overall for sure. Now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about the 2023 NASCAR schedule and NASCAR-owned tracks at the same time as well. Steve Phelps is at that big event, and he says that the 2023 schedule will not look like the 2022 schedule as well, and he's hoping to basically set for 2022 to keep a little bit of fresh air going into 2023. In addition to that, he talked about NASCAR-owned tracks, and he says if it doesn't make sense to go to one of our tracks twice, and we only go to once, or we go once out, and it doesn't make sense to go at all, we're going to do that because we have to grow the sport. First, talking about the 2023 schedule, I think that there are going to be quite a few big changes that are going to come on the schedule. Now, what big changes do I think are going to come to the 2023 schedule? I look at a few potential changes. I do think they're going to be racing up in the Northwest. I do think if that Xfinity Series race at Portland does very, very well, and it brings a lot of audience, I do think a potential race for the Cup Series at Portland is going to be really, really good, especially since there's been a lot of push to get up into that Pacific Northwest area. I think that makes a lot of sense. I also look at some street courses. There's been talk about some potential street courses. Remember, we got the Chicago Street Course. I think that Chicago Street Course race is going to happen in 2023. We've also talked about maybe racing up in the Meadowlands in the New York area. I know that there's a race at Watkins Glen, but there's talk about potentially racing in the New York area. There's also been mentions about racing in Denver. There's also been mentions about racing down south in Mexico City and potentially going up into Canada. To me, I think at the next 2023 schedule, if this year there aren't as many changes, though there still are quite a few changes, I do think that there are quite a few changes that are going to be coming to the 2023 schedule. In regards to what changes I'd like to see for 2023, I do think that there are a lot of tracks that need to cut back on having 2 dates from dropping to 2 down to 1 dates. First track, Richmond Raceway. I don't think Richmond deserves 2 dates, especially both of them that are in the regular season. I used to understand why Richmond got 2 dates, and I get that we'd be losing a short track, but I don't think Richmond deserves 2 dates in my personal opinion. I just think the racing has kind of been not that great over the last few years. Maybe Alex Bowman can go in there to basically tear it down. Alex Bowman kind of affected it to move it out of the regular season, which I think was the right call, but I don't think Richmond is a track that, in my opinion, deserves 2 dates. Another track that does not deserve 2 dates, especially when it comes to attendance, I think has to go to Atlanta Motor Speedway. Atlanta Motor Speedway got 2 dates once again for the first time in nearly 10 years in 2020. The attendance, though, for the fall race, or the summer race, excuse me, I should say, was absolutely appalling. Only half attendance for that event. The Xfinity Series race, from what I heard, was basically had there. So there's a few tracks that definitely should lose it to sacrifice for some new tracks getting on the schedule. I'm already becoming intrigued for 2023, even though we're not even out of the 2021 season. I'm very intrigued to see what the schedule is going to look like going into next year. I think it's going to be really, really exciting regardless, and we'll have to wait and see what happens in regards to that. And now we're going to jump on to the first of three major stories of today's episode, as we're going to talk about hybrid engine components. Now, Steve Phelps also said today that the probably 2024 will be the most likely when NASCAR will have some type of hybrid engine system with an electrification components inside the car. Now, what these electrification components are expected to be is more increased horsepower, similar to what like the system they have in IndyCar that they have right now, the push to pass. Even though I don't expect that that's what it's going to be. It's going to be similar to push to pass, where you're going to be able to get a little bit of extra horsepower as well. To me, I understand that a lot of fans are not going to be wanting any sort of electrification components inside the cars. But at the same time, we have to get with the times, and every other motorsport right now is making that move to go into hybrid situation. And one thing that's really, really important to note when it comes to hybrid engines and electrification, the sound is one thing that NASCAR said that they're planning to, and they're hopefully not going to be going away. Look, I understand that fans don't want even a full electrification, and we'll talk about an all-electric series that could be coming really, really soon. But we will say this, I'm not against NASCAR going at least in this direction just a little bit if it's going to be just keep up with the times. We have to keep up with the times eventually. I understand the NASCAR sport has been around for a very, very long time. I know fans want to stay stuck in the past. But we're not in the 1970s or 80s anymore. We have to get with the times. We have to stay with the times. And we have to work with the manufacturers and stuff. Now, I also have one thing that I will say is that I think it will be able to help with horsepower, especially with the packages that are coming. It'll be a new engine. So it'll be a new engine overall from the ground up. Again, we don't know exactly what the horsepower will be for that new engine. I would assume probably that engine will probably be around 650 horsepower. And one thing that this new engine could eventually bring in is new manufacturers. The biggest reason that they are saying that the engines are going to be very, very not going to have a lot of horsepower next year on the intermediate tracks is because of this reason alone, trying to bring in new manufacturers in the sport. Now, I do think that's a little bit of excuse considering optics for television and all that stuff. But to me, I do think it makes a lot of sense to bring in some sort of hybrid system in these cars. And I think going forward, especially with electrification, I do think it's going to make a lot of sense going forward. So to me, I think it's really, really, again, I've seen a lot of people that are not happy about this, and I get the frustration because you don't want any sort of electrification. I think when fans see this, so thinking, oh, this car is going to go fully electric. And that eventually is probably going to happen, but that's probably not going to happen at least for another 15 years. But with some of these manufacturers like Chevy and Ford, they are already making electrification components. You look at Chevy, they've already said in GM, they're planning to, by 2035, have all of their cars basically be electrified. So eventually NASCAR is going to have to go in that direction. But I think a hybrid system definitely makes a lot of sense. I'm really happy that they're looking at that for the foreseeable future of NASCAR. I think it makes a lot of sense for that, and I'm really happy for the future in that aspect. And now we're going to jump on to the next major story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about an all-electric series. Now, Steve Phelps reiterated and talked about the potential of an all-electric series all-electric series exhibition series. He says, we're entertaining opportunities to look at electric. Maybe do an exhibition series. Nothing to announce on that for sure at this moment. We do need to make sure that we're relevant when it comes to that moment. I think this absolutely makes a lot of sense. Remember, we talked about this on the channel, I believe back in July or June, that NASCAR had been looking at potentially going to an all-electric series. And to me, I absolutely 100% think makes a lot of sense for the future. I know, like I said, a lot of fans are not going to be happy about this all-electric series, but keep this in mind, this is not going to be in one of your three big series. You're still probably going to have the Cup Series by this time the series comes around. You're still probably going to have your Xfinity Series, and you're going to have your Truck Series. But another big benefit to this is, well, and you also look at other things as well. You have Formula E, and I know this series has had issues with succeeding, but that series has been slowly succeeding. And you have also the Extreme E series, and that's starting to do really, really good for that kind of racing as well. And what do those series have in common that NASCAR is trying to bring in? manufacturers. You're going to potentially be able to bring in new manufacturers into the sport for the future of NASCAR. I look at some manufacturers. I think Chevy, Ford, and Toyota will be three of those manufacturers, of course, that would run in those events. But just think overall about the potential manufacturers that could join NASCAR with this. One manufacturer absolutely think about that could be part of this all-electric series, I think, is absolutely Honda. There's been rumors about Honda potentially being a new manufacturer for NASCAR. This is where they could potentially be going to for the all-electric series. That absolutely could be the case where they're going. I think that Honda at some point will join the main NASCAR frame as a main manufacturer to bring new teams into the sport by that particular point. But I think Honda would be another manufacturer considered. Another manufacturer in what I would think absolutely could be up for consideration. I know this is crazy. I know a lot of you are not think that it's not going to make any sense. Tesla. I think Tesla absolutely could do this. I think Tesla could join an all-electric series. Tesla is one of the fastest growing car brands out there. It's the biggest brand when it comes to all-electric cars. It's been very successful. I've been seeing more Teslas as the years have gone on, and I think it would bring new manufacturers in, like Tesla. Another manufacturer, Nissan. You could bring Nissan in there. I believe they have an all-electric car for Nissan, or they're getting close to having an all-electric car for Nissan, so that definitely could be a consideration going forward. Another manufacturer, Hyundai. Hyundai's absolutely one. There's been talk about Hyundai potentially joining NASCAR, and I think Hyundai could be another consideration. I think the final main one that I'm going to say here is Kia. I think they're looking at a lot of those Japanese brands. I think Kia does have a plant in, I don't remember exactly, I think they have a plant currently in the United States. Same with Toyota, who has a plant in Kentucky. I think it's definitely really interesting, though, that NASCAR is looking, once again, at an all-electric series. And like I said, I understand the frustration about this, but at the same time, NASCAR, like I said, does have to get with the times, and they have to stay up with tech and everything. So to me, I think it absolutely 100% makes sense for them to run this all-electric series. I think it will be big regardless when it does happen and when it does get announced. When do I think we will get an all-electric series? I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. I think that most likely the earliest that we could see an all-electric series is probably around the time the new TV contract rolls around, which is 2025, which is 4 years down the road. And I think NASCAR will continue talking about it. I would not be shocked if we hear a lot more details going in this even into next year. I don't think it is going to be anytime soon, but I think it'll be very, very soon. We'll hear more details about that. I think as early as next year, we're going to hear more about that. And I'm really excited about the series. I think it's really, really cool. I know a lot of fans are not going to be happy about an all-electric series, but I do think it makes a lot of sense for the growth of the sport in the future of the sport to have an all-electric. And it's an exhibition series. And another thing I didn't mention is this could be a new area to bring new development into the series. If the ARCA series Flanders, this could also replace the ARCA series. So you could have another area for development going forward. We're going to have to wait and see what happens, but definitely some very intriguing news in regards to the all-electric series. And now we're going to jump on to the final major story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about the next-gen test. This has been the biggest topic that everybody's been talking about, is the next-gen test that has been taking place over the last couple days. The next-gen test took place on Monday and Tuesday, both days from 9 to 7. NASCAR actually live streamed both of those days. On Tuesday, they televised from 11 to 6 Central Time, so 12 to 7 Eastern Time. And today, they televised, I believe, from, 10 a.m. to around 6 p.m. So they televised majority of the day for fans to watch that event. 21 cars enter for this event, including multiple Hendrick cars, basically to test. This is the most cars that have tested with the next-gen car so far at this particular point. You had some teams that brought 2 cars. If you had 3 or 4 cars in the field in your organization, you could run multiple cars in this test and get a lot of feedback and stuff. And I think a lot of it, of course, is feedback. Today's test also features 670 horsepower, and yesterday's test features 670 horsepower and 2.5-inch spoiler. Now, we'll talk about the horsepower and the size of the spoiler here in just a little bit for next year, but they ran a 670 horsepower, which is going to be on the short tracks and the road courses next year, if you're wanting to know. And another thing we'll look at is the number placement on these cars. I was not a big fan of the number placement at the beginning, even moving it forward, regardless of moving forward or backwards. I'm a usual traditionalist, but the more that I've looked at the car, the more I've seen it in action, it really doesn't affect me. I'm actually not frustrated about it as much as I have been. Again, I'd rather traditionally have it in the center of the door. I'd rather traditionally have it there. But at the same time, I do think that some teams have done a really good job. I look at Ty Dillon's car. It looks really, really good. I think Ross Chastain's looks pretty solid. I think that Tyler Reddick's looks really, really good. I think Trackhouse's look extremely good. I like the number placement on the car, and if it's going to help bring sponsorships in NASCAR, so be it. I'm definitely for that on that front, and I'm happy about that on that front for sure. Next thing I want to talk about is the sounds. I got to hear the sounds live, and oh my gosh, the sounds of the cars are absolutely outstanding. It's got that throaty, beefy sound, and it sounds a little bit quiet at points as well. But in the infield, you could hear it, and it just sounds very, very throaty. I don't think I've ever heard that sound on a car, maybe IndyCar. I know people bring up IndyCar for it to sound similar to that, but the car just sounds throaty, and it sounds really, really awesome on those fronts. But those are the big positives coming out. Let's talk about some of the issues. First thing, heating issues. There have been a lot of heating issues with this car that started out at Daytona. Multiple drivers have complained about it, and many people in the industry have talked about the heating issues, but NASCAR has been trying to fix those heating issues. Yesterday, they tried out shorter exhaust pods, I believe with the 17 car and the 42 car, and then on the second day, they had, I think, Martrix Jr., Chris Buescher, I think Alex Bowman, I think someone else. They were able to test the shorter exhaust pipes as well for the cooling situation. On top of that, today as well, with that, they also basically had the window ducts up on the front, slit open up just a little bit to try to be able to get the heating issues situated. John Props did say yesterday that they are looking at to try to fix those heating problems. I do think it is a vendor issue. I think that's one thing that NASCAR is going to have to do is go back to the vendors, figure out the situation with the heating problems. The next thing I want to talk about, steering issues. There have been a lot of drivers that have been complaining about steering issues, including drivers like Ryan Blaney. I think Tyler Reddick had complaints about it. Corey LaJoie had thoughts about it. Joey Logano says stuff about the issues with steering. Oh, and also I think Alex Bowman was another driver. Because of steering and rack pinions, that stuff apparently is coming loose with the steering, and their cars are definitely spinning out. And that's one thing, is that steering issues are something that they're going to have to get used to. Again, this is something that they can fix because remember, they're running a rack and pinion steering, which is much different than the traditional steering. This car is completely different, and it's something we haven't seen ever. So I definitely do think that the rack and pinion steering is causing those potential issues. And even the driver said that NASCAR will probably find a way to fix it. And NASCAR did try some stuff in regards to steering. They are going to go back to the drawing board in regards to that. And they're going to try to fix those potential issues with the steering on that front. So that's one thing NASCAR will hopefully get fixed. That's one thing that has 100% be fixed when it comes to the next gen test. That's one thing that, and it's one thing for testing, right? It's a good way, of course, to get your focus on and help with the car. Maybe we'll see more about that, and we're gonna have more tests coming up really, really soon, which we'll talk about in a second. There were some spins and crashes over the 2 days. Chris Buescher spun going into turn number 1 at the Starr Roval. Ryan Blaney actually spun multiple times on the backstretch. Denny Hamlin, who was driving the 23 car, because the engine, I think, something blew up in the 23 car. Said the car was, the 11 car, excuse me. He said something in that car was particularly broken. He spun out on the infield portion of the racetrack. That happened in the test. Next thing, Corey LaJoie also mentioned, I think, in an interview, and he talked about this early in the day on the next day, which we'll get into that, but he said that he hopes, and he had really, really good thoughts on his Twitter, talking about he's a big fan of the sequential shifter, talked about that he hopes that it will bring the field closer together. And I'm going to say this. I do think that there is a very strong chance that you're going to be able to have an opportunity to bring the field closer in some aspects. But I don't think that you're going to immediately have everybody coming together. I still think that the cream is going to rise to the top. Teams like your Hendricks, teams like your Joe Gibbs, teams like Penske, teams like SHR are still going to rise to the top. But I would not be shocked if you do see a few surprise winners next year and potentially some very upset, really strong runs from teams where they lead a lot of laps. I'd like to see that once again. Like I said, I do expect that, but with everything basically getting bought from one company now, including the chassis, where you really can't change the chassis anymore, and they talked about that today. That is one thing I really, really, really like, and basically said that's one thing they will continue having going forward. And that's one thing. Another thing that got talked about was there were potential some braking issues and stuff, though they did say that braking was really, really good on that front. Now let's talk about the packages, because we need to get into that. So, for the short tracks in the road courses, there might be more tracks that are included in this, maybe like a Gateway or Darlington, but they're probably going into the intermediate session. For the short tracks in the road course races, they are going to have 670 horsepower and a 4-inch spoiler. For the intermediate tracks, they're going to have a 550 horsepower, and they're going to be 8 inches as well. The Daytona Talladega races, super speedways right now are not determined at this given moment. I saw a lot of fans that were very, very frustrated about this. And let me say, I'm not a big fan of the 550 horsepower package. However, I do want to say this. This is going to be a new car, and what that rear diffuser is going to do on the back of the car is hopefully going to be able to clean up the dirty air on those cars. That's one thing a lot of fans are hoping and praying in regards to the next-gen car is they're going to be able to clean up that dirty air in the back of the car so you can still get a run. If you're a better car, you can move to the inside and be able to pass. One thing that Tyler Reddick mentioned in the test today, and he talked about this at the same time as well, Tyler Reddick said that he liked what he was seeing out there, but he also did mention at the same time that he wishes there was a little bit less downforce. Now, one thing I will say is that the more downforce you have on these cars, the more dirty air you're going to create. And I'm going to say this about the short tracks and the road courses. I do think that with the spoiler being a little bit higher and the speeds going up a little bit and the horsepower being down just a tad bit, I do think that there is potential going into next year that you're going to have potential problems going into next year with dirty air. Not as much because that rear diffuser will hopefully be able to clean up some of that dirty air. You're still potentially going to have dirty air problems in behind there, but not as many as what NASCAR is thinking. So hopefully with the 550 and the 670 packages, that will be talked about going forward. One thing that's also going to be used next year is they're going to be using chrome numbers going into next year. That's one thing I noticed on Daniel Suarez's car, and NASCAR is going to be giving the option for teams to be able to do that. Of course, NASCAR is going to have to give approval in regards to those tires, but they're going to be allowing chrome numbers next year. And another thing that is also been talked about is a rear view camera. Ryan Blaney said today that he said it's probably going to be mandatory in 2023 for that rear view camera, but at least for next year, that rear view camera on those cars is going to be optional. Some teams are going to be allowed to use like the traditional mirrors on their car, but they're also can run the new rear view camera mirrors that they're going to use on those cars. That's one thing that's going to be going on into next year. Next, let's talk about the upcoming tests and all the organizational tests. So, upcoming tests for this. There's going to be a test at the Charlotte Oval next month. Then there is going to be a test at Phoenix on December 14th and 15th. I believe the Charlotte Oval test is going to take place, I believe, on the 20th. I think it's about a week before Thanksgiving is when that Charlotte Oval test is going to happen. Then the final test, the main test, will be on a Daytona test, will be on January 11th and 12th. That test is expected to have at least 30, potentially 25, or potentially even more cars show up. The Charlotte Oval tests are expected to have a lot of teams, including Front Row Motorsports. One thing to note is that Front Row Motorsports did not test today. They said they basically opted out of testing for that, so they did not test today as well. There are going to be a few organizational tests and probably more going down the road. There will be organizational tests at Las Vegas, Kansas, and Martinsville, and apparently they also mentioned a potential other spring race that will be determined down the road for tire tests and organizational tests as well. There's also going to be a tire test at Bowman Gray Stadium. Now, the reason that tire test is going to be taking place at Bowman Gray Stadium is because of the LA Coliseum, and basically the season for college football is still going to be going on at that particular time up until late January, and they're not going to be able to have enough time to get that ready to go and have a test out there to test it, because again, it's going to be a new surface, and they're going to be testing at Bowman Gray Stadium for a tire right there. Also, the Bristol Dirt tire test is one of the last major points I want to talk about before we get into what Ryan Blaney had to say, is that the Bristol Dirt tire test will be taking place on November 16th, which will be, think, a day or two before the other test, and this will be taking place at Wymanville in North Carolina. And the driver for that is going to be Stuart Friesen. I think this means that Stuart Friesen will not compete in the Cup Series race at Bristol Dirt. What they're doing here is they're not giving an advantage to any of the drivers that are going to be competing in that event, which I absolutely think makes a lot of sense, and I think it's a really good decision by NASCAR on their front that they're not going to be allowed there. One last thing I want to talk about is what Ryan Blaney had to say today. Ryan Blaney mentioned talking about wheel hop, and he mentioned that wheel hop is no longer there, and that basically said that lockup is still going to be a thing going into next year, but he said that wheel hop is really, really gone. I'm really happy about that because I'd rather lock up the tires than have wheel hop on the cars. Now that's really all my opinion talk on all the points that I want to talk about. I want to give my overall thoughts about the next-gen car as a whole. Some of the things I've been hearing are very, very positive, and some of the things I've been hearing have been absolutely negative. Like I said, I'm not entirely the biggest fan of the whole of them dropping the 550 package on there. I know there have been rumors about potentially 650 horsepower at every single race. The Door Bumper Clear Podcast has said that there have been conversation and talks about them running only 650 at every track besides the super speedways. But I guess that changed, and I know that they had talked about this all the way back in May. Keep in mind, NASCAR can make a decision to change what they decide to do in regards to horsepower in their engines, and maybe NASCAR is not going to be a fan of what they see at the Charlotte Oval, but I expect NASCAR to keep these engines going forward. And if they can make the racing really, really good with the rear diffuser, though you're still going to have dirty air effects on it, I think that it is not the end of the world. I do like the fact, like I mentioned from Ryan Blaney's comments, I do like that there's no wheel hop on the cars. I think wheel hop is really, really dumb and stupid. I think wheel hop shouldn't be a thing, and I'm glad it's probably not going to be a thing next year. I also do like the fact that NASCAR is going to have a few more tests going forward here in the foreseeable future to kind of give a glimpse and a look at that. So we'll have to wait and see what happens in regards to the next-gen test. Those are just a lot of topics in conversation. Again, remember, keep in mind, we haven't seen this car race. I think we're going to get a lot more of a better look at the intermediate package. A lot of drivers said that the car was very, very fun. Drivers like Corey LaJoie were saying it was very, very fun. Tyler Reddick said it was really, really fun. But I think going into next test at the Charlotte Oval, that's going to be a really big indicator because we're going to be using that package at a ton of races next year. So going into this next test, which will be coming up very, very soon, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. But I'm definitely sure some pretty interesting and strong points. You're probably going to hear a lot from other YouTubers that are probably talking about this at this given moment on their thoughts and 2 cents. But to me, that's just my honest opinion on this next-gen test. I'm really happy about what I've been hearing, and it's really good news overall for sure. So, anyway, that is it for today's NASCAR news video. I want to thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe to the channel, turn notifications on so you're notified when a video does go live on my channel. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and support page as well. Let's get you below for that and comment your thoughts on today's video. What are your thoughts about the next-gen tests that took place this week at the Charlotte Roval? Let me know in the comments below. And what are your thoughts about the all-electric series that could potentially be coming to NASCAR in the future? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, like I said, I want to thank you guys for watching today's video, and I'll see you guys next time for some more great and awesome NASCAR content on the channel like this. Take care, everybody.